Hi, I'm David Cleon. I'm a former editor at Blogging Heads TV. My current gig is I'm editing at Al Jazeera America. I just started that, editing opinion, but I'm just speaking here in a personal capacity. And I'm in New York City, and I'm talking to John Kay, who is in Ottawa, Canada at the moment. John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Jonathan Kay. I edit a magazine called The Walrus. Uh, Readers can see it at thewalrus.ca. I also am a columnist for a Canadian newspaper called The National Post. I write books, and I'm happy to appear on Blogging Heads TV.
Yeah, and we've done a couple of these before, which we may refer back to. But so we're here this week. We're recording this Wednesday night. Monday night, Canada had what I think is fair to say is its most dramatic federal elections in many years. Would you agree with that?
It was a transformative election.
Yeah.
I, Historical comparisons are difficult. There's never been a third place party. I know for American listeners, if there are American listeners, we have more than two parties. We have the Liberals, we have the Conservatives, and we were in the unusual position before this election of the Liberals, who are usually akin to the Democrats. They had been relegated to third place because of their disastrous showing in the last election in 2011. Some people even predicted that they would become extinct, that they would be replaced by more obscure parties such as the NDP or the Greens. And this is the first time in Canadian electoral history, as I understand, that a third place party has roared into majority territory. In our parliamentary tradition, there's minority governments, which are weak, and then there's majority governments, where the same party controls the executive and the legislature. And this is the position that Justin Trudeau's Liberals are in now. And that sort of transformation, it indeed has been transformative, and it is by far at least the most important election in a generation.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as an outsider, following it kind of sporadically in the weeks and months leading up to it, it seemed like it was genuinely a three-way race for a while. So, I mean, we should give background here for people who don't follow Canadian politics, which I imagine is most Americans. But the prime minister for the last, I think it's 9 years, is that right?
Yeah, almost 10, in fact.
Almost 10 years has been a conservative named Stephen Harper. And for part of that period, he was the Conservatives basically had a plurality of parliament. Eventually, they had an outright majority. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think it's 2011 they got their majority. And
Right,
since then, and in the majority, they were able to do pretty much anything they wanted.
right. And Harper, Canada has a reputation in the United States as being a very liberal country, which relative to the United States is true in a lot of ways. But Harper is actually a genuinely conservative figure. He would be, I would think, at least a kind of moderate Republican. I mean, the Republican Party has gone pretty far right, but you could imagine him as a kind of, in line with Mitt Romney or John Boehner or someone like that. I mean, I don't know. You might disagree with that, but he was a fairly right wing leader, and it looked like he stood a decent chance of winning a fourth term. And then you had these two opposition parties, the NDP, which, as I understand it, was a kind of left-leaning party, but it moved toward the center in this campaign under the leadership of Thomas Mulcair. And then you have the Liberals, who are traditionally the centrist or center-left party, but moved a little more in a left-wing direction, and who are led by Justin Trudeau, who is the son of a very famous, revered by some, despised by others, uh, left-leaning prime minister from what, the 70s?
Yeah, well,
Uh,
in fact, his rise to prominence came in the late 60s
yeah.
and 1970s. He he's the Ronald Reagan of the Canadian left. Let's put it that way. Yeah,
Pierre Trudeau, we're
Pierre
talking
Trudeau.
about,
Yeah.
yes. And he was a kind of a legendary figure, right? I mean, he was a intellectual and a kind of a cultural elite, and dated a lot of famous women. His ex-wife seems to have dated a lot of famous men. and moved Canada dramatically to the left of the U.S. I guess permanently so.
Yeah, Pierre Trudeau is everything you just described. Kind of a very strange figure in that he is a defining figure of the Canadian left in the, I guess, the mid to late Cold War period. But also, there was something kind of strangely Playboy Mansion about him. Barbara Streisand dated him, and he
Right.
drove this fancy limited production Mercedes-Benz convertible. He was sort of oddly a fashion icon for a while. There's never been anyone quite like him in Canadian politics. Canada is not a country that produces political celebrities, certainly not political celebrities on an international scale. He was perhaps the only one we have ever produced. And now his son has become prime minister. This in a country that also does not produce political dynasties.
Right.
There is no equivalent to the Bush family. There's no equivalent to the Adams family going back 2 centuries. And now, for the first time, we do have a genuine political dynasty.
Well, I was going to say also, it looked, a few months ago like the Conservatives could win, Trudeau could win, even Mulcair and the NDP could win. In the end, it was really a sweeping victory by the Liberals, right? Which I'm not sure anyone saw coming.
It was, well, it was the sort of thing that would be impossible in a two-party system. Because Canada has a three and in some provinces four-party system, you can get these sudden lurches. And the reason it happens is this, that you have an incumbent, Stephen Harper, who maybe 30% of the country still liked, and then you had, say, 70% of the country that disliked Harper. And a lot of the vote was with the Liberals, who are seen as center-left, and with the NDP, who are more union leftist, maybe radical left, some would say, except in this election they tack towards the center. And then you have the Green Party, and in Quebec you have the Bloc Québécois Party, which is a regional separatist Quebec party. And as between all those four parties, the one common denominator was that they wanted Stephen Harper out of office.
Right.
And what you had was this arithmetic dynamic where you'd get sudden lurches because if all you wanted is Stephen Harper out, you're going to vote the way your neighbor votes. Because if it looks like your riding, your district is going to go Liberal, you vote Liberal because that becomes the most efficient way to vote out the incumbent. And so you got these wild oscillations where people were simply basically voting for whichever center-left party, and there were more or less four in this election, they thought had the best chance in their riding of defeating the Conservatives. So at one point, the NDP they were set to win the election, according to some polls, maybe 6 or 8 weeks out, or maybe 2 or 3 months out. And then suddenly the polls shifted, and in fact, the NDP ended up having a disastrous run. But this was essentially a product of strategic voting, people shifting their vote at the last minute in order to accomplish their overarching objective, it turned out, of kicking Stephen Harper out. And they just shifted party brands according to whichever was the most efficient.
So it seems like before we get into Justin Trudeau and before we get into the NDP or anything else, it seems like we should really start with Harper. I mean, Harper has been around for a long time. It's been kind of funny to me that, notwithstanding that Canada is seen as to the left of the United States, we've had this kind of liberal icon president here, Barack Obama, and up until now, he's completely overlapped with this very conservative figure in Canada, who in some ways feels like a throwback to the George W. Bush era. I mean, that's maybe a little cruel to him, but it never seemed like Harper was genuinely popular in Canada. He had a core, and anyone who might have opposed him, it seemed like there was disarray, there was division, and he was able to take advantage of that to be a very successful politician for a very long time. But in the end, it seems like he kind of lost in an undignified way.
Yeah, he did. He did.
Yeah.
I should say that I voted for Harper twice in 2 previous elections. The reason I voted for Harper originally, and the reason a lot of people voted for Harper, was he was seen as an antidote to a liberal government from the 90s that had grown stale and entitled and self-serving, as all long-term administrations do under Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. And it was time for a shift, and Stephen Harper was the first credible alternative to the Liberals, who at the time were seen as Canada's natural national governing party. And some people thought that they were going to go on governing for decades. And as you say, Stephen Harper has very little charisma. No one liked him much, but he was seen as a competent political tactician, someone who's going to reverse some of the big government bloated excesses of the Liberal years. And he did a lot of that. It's very difficult to compare him to someone like George W. Bush, or in fact to any American conservative, because Canadian conservatism is so different. Canadian governments, even if they call themselves conservative, never make war on the welfare state.
Right.
If you look at Republicans, particularly Republicans in the so-called Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives, I mean, they really do talk about things like rolling America back to before the New Deal. And that kind of rhetoric actually sells very well on the GOP primary trail. There's no equivalent to that in Canada. Even Canadian conservatives have made their peace with the welfare state. And there is no equivalent to the Second Amendment in Canada. The idea of any kind of Canadian, even a conservative Canadian politician, coming out and saying that people should have the right to carry guns on university campuses, or any of the rhetoric you hear from the NRA, I mean, all of that is completely rejected in Canada.
Right.
Gun control, doesn't matter if you're conservative, you're liberal. Canada is a country that's deeply suspicious of guns. Abortion is available on demand. Canada is the only G7 country that has no abortion law whatsoever. And Harper has done nothing to change that. Gay marriage is the law of the land in Canada from coast to coast to coast. So on those issues, Harper hasn't done a thing to alter the hyper-liberal social consensus. There have been a few issues where he has been deeply conservative. One of them, a strangely symbolic issue, because there's a fairly small Jewish population in Israel. He has become...
In Canada.
Sorry,
Yeah.
what did I say? Yeah.
You said in Israel, but
Actually, there is quite a large Jewish population.
I've heard that. Yeah, quite a lot.
I misspoke. Yeah, Canada has a small Jewish population, but the conservatives made support of Israel this. I don't know the word to describe it. It was almost monomaniacal at times. That the conservatives were the party that were going to be better friends with Benjamin Netanyahu than anyone else in the world. And I think it is true that rhetorically, at least, Canada became a better friend of Israel than Barack Obama's administration in the United States. And it's this theme that became this dominant motif in the campaign, not just Israel, but fighting terrorism, fighting militant Islam, fighting moral relativism, speaking truth to power at the United Nations.
Right.
Fighting political correctness.
What a critic might characterize it as a kind of neoconservative bent to Canadian foreign policy under Harper.
Yeah, except the thing about neoconservatism in the United States is the American military actually had the capacity to back up the mantras of neoconservatism. Whereas in Canada, it had a almost entirely symbolic character because our military is so small. And our contributions to military operations against ISIS, for instance, were always symbolic and minuscule.
Right.
And unlike the United States, we don't give billions of dollars to Israel. For the most part, these are almost entirely symbolic gestures. But they became very central to Harper's identity. And you alluded to this briefly. You said that he went out in a very undignified way. That's entirely true. Because one of the ways in which he tried to extrapolate this hardline approach against militant Islam and Sharia and terrorism and all that sort of Fox News, all those themes that you see in the United States so often, is he talked about banning the niqab, which is to say Islamist or Islamic, whichever you prefer, face covering on women. He made an issue of banning women wearing the niqab from citizenship ceremonies, and possibly even public servants in Canada. it was an issue that affected a very, 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 very tiny number of Canadians. I think there were only something like 2 women who had sought to wear the niqab during Canadian citizenship ceremonies out of millions and millions of immigrants over the last few years. But it resonated with sort of, the nativists, the Archie Bunker types, who saw in this one tiny issue a kind of symbolic defense of Western civilization. And so the issue got a lot of prominence and became very ugly. And the fact that the Conservatives relied on it to drum up support was very undignified. And I think it was a black mark on the Conservative record, which is really too bad because I think for most of his tenure, Stephen Harper was a pretty good prime minister. Free trade from start to finish, mostly balanced budgets, kept Canada in good economic shape even during the 2008 financial crisis. Our banks did just great. There's a whole range of accomplishments he can point to. And then his swan song ended up being a very ugly and some would even say bigoted campaign in an attempt to get votes in the October 19th election this year.
Yeah, so I was referring to the niqab. There was one other thing I was referring to as well, which is a perennial favorite topic of ours, going back to previous dialogues we've done, which is this last-minute rally he did with. Well, so you said earlier that Pierre Trudeau is Canada's only real celebrity politician, but that's not entirely true. Of course, Canada has one other completely different celebrity politician, the Emperor of Toronto, Rob Ford, who Harper had a last-minute rally with, and with his more sober brother, Doug Ford, in one of these Toronto suburbs that I understand.
Etobicoke,
which I understand. These Toronto suburbs that are considered Ford Nation are actually kind of a national swing district. Is that right?
It's kind of weird because Etobicoke is actually, it's part of Toronto. It's as much part of Toronto as where the CN Tower is.
Right.
But most downtown elites might dismiss Etobicoke as a suburb.
Well, because these were all annexed in 1998, right? These far-flung places that used to be suburbs and still feel like suburbs, but...
in the same way that I guess if Manhattan were its own city and then suddenly it gobbled up Bronx and Brooklyn and Staten Island and became the modern New York City, that's kind of what Toronto did. And Rob Ford, who was the mayor, he's no longer the mayor. He's been replaced by a perfectly dignified and intelligent man named John Tory.
Right, and I suppose for anyone who somehow missed it, we should just mention that Rob Ford, during his stint as Toronto mayor, gained international notoriety for smoking crack, being frequently drunk and belligerent in public, racist remarks, homophobic remarks, assaulting staffers, and just generally being a buffoonish figure. And since Toronto is seen as a fairly cosmopolitan city, it was surprising to a lot of Americans that this figure was its mayor. But the story behind that, as John and I have discussed before, was what was the annexation of these suburbs and a feeling in many of them that they were disenfranchised relative to the urban core. And so to kind of troll the urban core, they voted for this right-wing populist figure who would humiliate downtown elites on the world stage.
Yeah, that's exactly what you said. And he really was, he was as close to an actual troll as a politician could be. And he still remains to this day. He's a city councillor.
Yeah.
It's unfair. Well, I think it's inaccurate to call him a celebrity in the same way Trudeau is a celebrity. Trudeau was an A-lister, and Ford is kind of even at the height of his fame was kind of like a C-lister. And now he's a D-lister, and he's seen as a figure of disgrace. To give you just some indication, he once publicly called Justin Trudeau a fag, was the term he used.
Classy. Very
Yeah,
classy.
and what's interesting is a lot of people don't even know that because it's like item number 187 on the list of incredibly stupid things he said. But the reason we're talking about all this is because Stephen Harper, 2 days before this incredibly close, or what was supposed to be an incredibly close election, while Justin Trudeau was barnstorming across Western Canada, attracting thousands of people to rallies in Stephen Harper's backyard out in Alberta, Stephen Harper himself made the inexplicable decision to attend a rally in Etobicoke with Rob Ford. This is the disgraced person who's guilty of the litany of horrible things that you just described, and his brother Doug, who is not, to my knowledge, a crackhead or anything like that, but is kind of an abrasive, thuggish figure. And Harper, for some strange reason, appeared in a photo op, appeared at this rally with these two men. The entire our jaw just kind of collectively dropped. It's kind of I'm trying to put it in American terms, but it's as if Ted Cruz on his, the last legs of some important state primary showed up at the house of the Kardashians for a day or two and did photo ops. Like it made no sense. And it was kind of disappointing because people like me who, I've been critical of Stephen Harper's campaigning style, but in the back of my mind, I always thought he was kind of this tactical genius and there was some kind of method to his madness and it was all going to come together at the last minute. And then for him to go into, essentially Canada's political dumpster and hang out with the Fords 2 days before the election, it was such a dumb thing to do and such a graceless way to go out.
I mean, I guess he must have thought that this is a swing district. Ford has his core supporters, and if you can turn them out in force in a tight election. But I mean, it just looks so bad. And
but who cares? Even if it's a swing district, there's 337 other ridings.
Right.
So even if you do win this riding, there's 337 others where they're saying, "My God, what an idiot! I can't vote for this man."
Right, I mean, and it's not like he's an obscure figure. It's not like he's some problematic local politician, but the rest of the country doesn't care about him. I mean, he's a legendary disaster, and it seems insane that you would associate yourself with him.
And by the way, in this way, Canadian politics is very different from American politics in that we have 338 ridings. I'm unsure of the number because we had 308. It expanded this year. I think it's 338. Each riding is worth exactly the same for getting your parliamentary majority. The same is not true in the United States because of the way the Electoral College works.
Yeah.
So if you can glom onto some incredibly parochial issue in Florida or in Ohio and swing that state by 20,000 votes, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, to swing Florida or swing Ohio, talking a swing of like 50 or 60 or 70 Electoral College votes in terms of when you double up the swing, there's no equivalent to that in Canada. You win a riding, you win one riding out of 338. So it makes no sense to take a huge risk for one or two ridings. And I mean, Harper's base is in Western Canada. He ended up being vulnerable all across the country. From Atlantic Canada, he did kind of okay in Quebec. Ontario ended up being a disaster. And if you look at where the Conservatives now have their seats, to a large extent, it's a large swath of Western Canada from Manitoba through Saskatchewan and Alberta, which basically is where Conservatives were back in the early 90s when they were still, for the most part, rallying under the banner of a party called the Reform Party, which kind of was a splinter of the old progressive Conservatives and was, in American terms, it was kind of a Midwestern prairie populist party, which was competing with the vestiges of the old progressive Conservative Party. And it was Stephen Harper who merged them, who brought the Conservatives back into unity, which is why he was a revered figure. And I guess he will continue to be a revered figure because he did win 3 terms. It's just too bad that his legacy will be seriously marred by what he did in his last couple of months in office.
Well, so aside from the Niqab and Ford decisions, which seem like decisions you would only make if you were already flailing and desperate, what explains besides just time and people getting tired of the status quo? What exactly explains Harper's vulnerability? Why did people turn against him?
Part of it is factors beyond his control. To give him his due, in politics, people get tired of incumbents. When you've been in office for almost a decade, Jean Chrétien was an incredibly powerful liberal prime minister. He won majority after majority. People got sick of him. People got sick of Brian Mulroney. People got sick of powerful premiers like Dalton McGuinty and Jean Charest. After 8 years, lots of people will be happy to see the backside of Barack Obama. To a certain extent, Harper was just suffering from the fact that after all those years in office, there's just a long list of things that people are pissed off about. There was no one single dominant thing. There was no Obamacare that was like this huge rallying point. There were a whole bunch of little things. Part of it was just that he became more mean, more irascible, more of a control freak, more petty as time went on. There's a guy named Tom Flanagan, who's a political science professor here in Canada, who's very close to Harper and helped get him elected originally. And Flanagan wrote a book recently talking about how Harper is a man of rages, a man who just wouldn't talk to anybody for days at a time. He became a very dark figure. And Justin Trudeau played to that because Justin Trudeau is just a relentlessly optimistic, happy person.
Right.
And a lot of the election was fought on that superficial basis, that people were tired of this mean-spirited prime minister, most of whom's election campaign consisted of trying to frighten old people with ads that suggested that if Justin Trudeau were elected, your kid will be smoking marijuana in a classroom with a teacher wearing a niqab, criminals will be running the streets, and Israel will be destroyed. He ran largely a fear-based campaign, which, he still got 31% of the vote or something. I mean, there still were old people who were willing to vote for that fear agenda. But by and large, most people were disgusted by that. But it was a 78-day campaign, which I realize doesn't sound like a lot for the United. I mean, it seems like the United States is perpetually in campaign mode.
It sounds wonderful.
78, it does, but It's actually the longest campaign in the history of modern Canadian politics. Typically, we have 5 or 6 week campaigns. This was an 11-week campaign, which was our campaign finance laws don't really permit candidates to collect that much money. So most of our parties don't have enough money to run long-term campaigns. 78 days was a long, long time. And for most voters, it was a long, long time to hear tiresome, embittered, negative, conservative campaign ads, which we just got tired of after a while.
Canada sounds like a very civilized country.
It is a civilized, that's the thing. And that's when I talk to people after this election, there really is a sense like we kind of got our country back a little bit. And I say this, as I say, I voted for Harper a couple of times. I guess I consider myself a centrist. I actually don't mind a lot of Harper's policies. His foreign policy stuff, I'm a Zionist myself, and I kind of liked. I thought he offered a corrective on some of the left-wing foreign policy tenets of the previous Liberal administration. I thought he did a good job on a lot of files. He tightened up our immigration system in an important way. He dealt with First Nations in a way that I thought was more responsible than Liberals. I actually didn't mind his policies, but as a Canadian, I self-identify with a certain attitude toward the world, a certain attitude toward new Canadians, toward other cultures. I think sometimes multiculturalism can be taken too far as a dogma, but like most Canadians, I'm truly allergic to anything that smacks of bigotry or of Donald Trump's idea of just building bigger and bigger fences to keep outsiders out. Canada has no equivalent to Marie Le Pen or anything like that. It's not that kind of country. And as soon as Harper started giving little hints of that, he turned a lot of people off, including me.
Yeah. Well, this seems like as good a time as any to transition to Trudeau, then, the winner. as far as Trudeau goes, I think a good place to start would be that you had a piece which we'll link to, or they'll link to, uh, in your magazine, The Walrus, called "The Justin Trudeau I Can't Forget." I have a tab open with that right now, in which you talk about having worked on a book project with Justin Trudeau, which means you actually know the new Prime Minister of Canada, or soon to be Prime Minister of Canada. And since you didn't vote for Harper, and since the piece was very positive, I'm going to take that as a hint that you probably did vote for the Liberals this time. Is that right?
I can't.
Oh, you can't
I
say.
can't say,
Okay. But in any case, why don't you share your personal impressions of Justin Trudeau as a first as a person and then also as a politician?
I mean, I don't want to overstate how well I know him. We worked on the project together, which meant I spent a lot of time at his office, and I spent some time at his home, and I met him and his family and a lot of his friends. And um, he's one of these guys. I think he's a relentlessly energetic and extroverted fellow. He's so extroverted and so physical. I mean, he's always popping up and strutting around and chopping the air with his hand. He has an abundant. He's a boxer and um, a snowboarder and an outdoor enthusiast. And
I should just jump in here also that on social media among political types in the United States, he has very quickly in the last 2 days drawn attention for being extremely attractive.
he's a very good-looking guy. Yeah,
And people who don't normally pay attention to Canadian politics are making a point of this. Like this is a dreamy guy.
he's a dreamy
So
guy. He's like
yeah.
6'3" or something. Perfect hair. He's only 3 years younger than me, but when the two of us were photographed together, I look like his dad. I mean, he's I think 44 now, and he looks 35, as I say. Um, and in politics, that's not a huge advantage. Like in politics, sometimes it pays to look older. Um, so he had that as a liability from a voting perspective. But when you're with him in the room, I mean, he's a ball of energy. And I'm actually interested to see how he's going to tolerate a life in politics, where much of it is going to be spent sitting behind a desk or in lengthy interviews or international conferences of one type or another. He is extremely youthful. His enthusiasms are so manic that they sometimes do come across as childlike, because we expect our politicians to be cynical and jaded, and so here we have a guy who is just burbling with extroverted excitement about meeting people. When you see him at campaign events, he's just hopping from one handshake to the next. And that's kind of what he's like in private, too. He's just, um, uh, he wears his heart on his sleeve when he's talking about his personal life sometimes. He's got 3 young kids and a beautiful wife who used to be a television personality in Quebec. Very, very, very different from the more old-fashioned and proper kind of political union that Stephen Harper and Lorena Harper were. Um, when you're with him, you can kind of see why some people caricature him as being not ready. I mean, that was the big conservative slogan, "This guy's not ready." Uh, because he he can kind of seem like someone who is just too manic for a political job. On the other hand, when you do get him to sit down and he talks, he's a smart guy. He's extremely well read. He is a disciplined politician. He's actually been a member of parliament since 2008. And he has very quickly made himself a student of politics and surrounded himself by other people who are professional students of politics. And I think this political campaign answered a lot of the doubts that people had. One of the reasons that Stephen Harper picked a 78-day political campaign for this election was the Conservatives assumed that Justin Trudeau, good looking as he is, charming as he is, would find a way to fall on his face several times over in a 78-day campaign. And in fact, just the opposite happened. He, despite all his manic energy and childlike enthusiasms, he actually ran a disciplined campaign over 78 days while somehow managing to maintain an aura of spontaneity and positivity and relentless energy throughout the campaign, in contrast to Stephen Harper's stolid control freak personality. It's, among other things, Trudeau's campaign will be remembered by political historians in Canada as just, from a technical point of view, a fantastic campaign.
You wrote in your piece about his relationship with his mother and how that shaped him. Can you talk? Because she actually, I didn't know anything about this before, but she seems to be a fascinating figure. Can you talk a little about how he grew up and how his parents shaped him? And
Yeah,
yeah,
she was a fascinating. It was a fascinating marriage because at the time his parents got married, I think his dad, Pierre Trudeau, who we've talked about, Prime Minister of Canada, I think he was closing in on 50 at the time, or certainly well into his 40s. And he married this very young woman from British Columbia, less than half his age. I think she was 20 or 21 or something like that. And she moved in to 24 Sussex, which is sort of our White House. And she became a political wife at an age when, it's like the age of a second or third year undergraduate, basically. And she was completely unsuited to political life. Pierre Trudeau was working long days, long nights, reading briefing documents. He was the most important man in the country. She was basically BC, British Columbia young woman who desperately missed her family life out in BC, completely became agitated and lonely and started acting out. And when Justin was just, I think, 3, 4, 5 years old, something like that, she basically walked out of the house and had a life as kind of a celebrity partier at Studio 54, and she partied with the Rolling Stones and all that sort of thing.
did she? She had relationships with Jack Nicholson and Teddy Kennedy. Apparently, is that?
I mean, there was some of the personal details are controverted, but she became sort of a globe-trotting party girl, while her husband, I'm not even sure they were divorced yet, was running a G7 nation. It was a weird time in Canada. And Justin Trudeau was at the heart of all of this. He was basically being raised by a single dad at a time when that was a very unusual thing. And he was in this weird position of having been abandoned by his mother. Look, these things
Right.
happen.
Well, she was bipolar, right?
It turns out she's
Yeah.
bipolar. We're talking about the early 70s, an age when people didn't talk about this much. When she tried to get help, even her own family members, some of them said, just stick it out. Don't go to a psychiatrist. They'll just say you're nuts, and the family will be stigmatized. And so now, by the way, I should say that Margaret Trudeau, who I interviewed for the book, she has very much come to terms with the legacy of mental illness. She's become an activist in the area, and she and Justin have mended fences over this. But at the time, Justin was in a very psychologically difficult place, having been abandoned, at least temporarily, by his mom. And as I've written, when something like that happens, you can turn yourself into a victim and a martyr and be passive aggressive about it, or you can decide that you're going to try and overcome it. And I think what happened was at a very young age, Justin decided that he was going to try to be the glue in his family. He was going to try and be the bonding agent between his parents. It's not an uncommon phenomenon among the children of divorced parents, but he took it to an energetic extreme. And I think it created this sort of mania in him to be hypersocial and hyper extroverted and to create bonds with people. And it became the core of his personality. Justin says that as long as he can remember, he has been just relentlessly social and relentlessly seeking human connections. This is one of the things that gives him this childlike quality.
Well, we should maybe briefly cover the NDP because it seems like they had there was a moment when it looked like Canada might have a new party, a left-leaning party in charge, and seem to have completely blown it. So what happened there? What's the story of the rise and fall of
Uh,
Mulcair?
Part of it, people have analyzed this to death, NDP partisans in particular. They said, where did we go wrong? As recently as a couple of months ago, it looked like we might form the first NDP government in the history of Canada. I think a lot of it just goes to strategic voting. And also we had, where, as I was saying before, you had people in different ridings who were just doing the math and saying, who's our best choice to get rid of Harper? And if, it's sort of like the Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. If a few influential people in your community say, well, I'm going to vote Liberal, it becomes this landslide Liberal because you're voting Liberal because your neighbor is voting Liberal. And that's how Mulcair lost a lot of the vote. But some of it went to the campaign style of Mulcair himself, because the NDP has historically been a union-driven, more militant left-wing party. Mulcair went in the opposite direction and became really self-consciously centrist, and he'd do these ads about middle-class voters, and he came across as very avuncular and calm, and kind of like a Ike Eisenhower figure. And a lot of the traditional leftists who were the core of the party were turned off by that. They wanted more of a fire-breathing campus radical. And Trudeau, being young and energetic and appealing to the youth vote in particular, was able to capture a lot of those disaffected NDP types. So that was a big deal. The other thing is we had many debates, and unlike American debates, there was a lot of substance in the Canadian debates. I mean, they discussed things like how much would you spend on infrastructure and what do you want to do about reforming the Canadian Senate. And Trudeau had been expected to perform very poorly in these debates, but actually did quite well. And Mulcair, the head of the NDP, who everyone knows of as a good debater and a smart person, was sort of hamstrung by the fact that he wanted to appear reserved and moderate and calm. And that kind of didn't work to his advantage because Trudeau was able to dominate the debates. And that was one of the factors that convinced a lot of people that this was the guy who was going to take on Harper. Because in the debates, Trudeau, although his campaign was generally optimistic, in the debates he was quite verbally aggressive in the way he took on Harper. Although interestingly, he took on Harper in the idiom of optimism. So, to paraphrase, he would say, Mr. Harper, you have turned Canada into a nation of fear, a nation of distrust. I want to return Canada to its roots as a happy multicultural place. And the message was positive, but he delivered it in a forthright, full-throated way that I think Harper's most impassioned opponents were attracted to, and that's why so many of them voted Liberal on election day.
My understanding is that Trudeau actually supports Keystone XL, which isn't to say it's going to happen. But in any case, this seems like a pretty important issue for Canada's future. And I also know that oil prices, I follow Russian politics a lot, actually, and I know that oil prices last year dropped precipitously, and that's probably affected Canada's economy a lot. So, yeah, what are the real implications of Trudeau's win in terms of energy policy, in terms of foreign policy, and in terms of
I think the energy file was a lot more important a year or two ago before oil demand started slumping a little bit. There was a period that Canada was literally producing so much oil we had no idea what to do with it. We didn't have enough pipeline capacity, and North America didn't have enough pipeline capacity because it's basically an interconnected web. And as a result, we were putting it on trains, and we had one horrible disaster in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, where a train exploded and dozens of people died. And it started off a debate about building pipelines. And Trudeau sort of split the difference and says, well, America should build Keystone XL, and we in Canada should build a pipeline from Alberta east toward Ontario. On the other hand, Trudeau did not want to build something called the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which would bring oil or bitumen from Alberta to the Pacific coast, from which it could go onward to East Asia. This was an urgent debate a year or two ago. It's not such an urgent debate now. The more urgent debate is about things like infrastructure spending. Cities like Toronto just are completely choked by traffic. They need billions in infrastructural upgrades. Trudeau has signaled that he's going to be the infrastructure prime minister. And in fact, he's willing to run a deficit in order to take this opportunity, this historic opportunity, when interest rates are low, to create more infrastructure. He's also indicated a shift in taxation. He's going to essentially soak the 1%. Fighting income inequality has been one of his themes. Climate change, unlike the Conservatives who barely acknowledge climate change as a scientific reality, Trudeau is actually going to have a solid plan, he says, to fight climate change. I mean, these are big, meaty, expensive policy issues, and on several fronts, Trudeau is going to come out with big interventionist, big government plans. There's no hiding the fact that this is a big shift to the left for Canada after a decade during which, on many issues, not all, but on many issues, Canada has come to resemble the United States in its conservatism.
I mean, your friend David Frum had a piece in The Atlantic, or I think he had pieces both before and after the election that were pretty apocalyptic in tone. Is he? I mean, he's a conservative, obviously, but is he overreacting? I mean, how?
Yes.
Yes.
Look, David Frum was a columnist for me for many years when I was at the National Post. He's someone whom I've spoken to often about everything under the sun. I've sought advice for him. I think some of the stuff he's written about American politics in the last couple of years has been extraordinarily insightful, and I've said as much on Twitter. But as this election has approached, David Frum has alienated much of the journalistic class in Canada by writing things that I regard as somewhat shrill, almost suggesting that Canadians would be disappointing David Frum if they were so unwise as to elect anybody except Stephen Harper. And a lot of what Frum has written seems to be very close to conservative government talking points. Not suggesting that David Frum is involved in any way institutionally with the conservative government, although it is true that his sister Linda Frum is a Canadian senator and was appointed by Stephen Harper as such. So David Frum, even though he's lived in Washington for many years, became extremely passionate about this election. And if his Twitter social media postings are any indication, he seems to have come to believe that Canada has gone down some irredeemably horrible, evil course by forsaking Harper. It has been, the tone of his writing has been quite apocalyptic, but it's been instructional in some ways because I know a lot of older Jewish Canadians who feel the same way and were somehow convinced by the Harper team that some conservative government in Ottawa somehow was the linchpin in the fight against global Islam and terrorism. It's an odd thing, but it happened. And I say this as someone who, you know, I'm all in favor of fighting terrorism and Islamism, and I'm in favor of supporting Israel. I just don't know how it became quite this obsessional propagandistic mania among partisans of a conservative government in what used to be a fairly moderate left-center country.
Well, there are actually many things I'd like to follow up on there and many other things I'd like to discuss, but it is awfully late and we've gone a while, so we should probably wrap it up. But if you have any final things you'd like to say about this election or David Frum or Canada, or actually, yeah.
Here's what I'll say. What I'll say is this, is that since, you know, maybe some of the people watching this are American, Canada is now very much the way America was in 2008, 2009, when you had a charismatic, left-leaning, youngish prime minister, president in the case of the United States, coming to power following multiple terms of a conservative predecessor. And like Obama in the late 2000s, Trudeau ran on a somewhat amorphous campaign of hope, change, optimism, sunniness, and a lot of voters projected their hopes and desires on Trudeau, much in the way that many voters projected their amorphous hopes and desires on Obama, I guess 6 or 7 years ago. Now is a crucial time for Trudeau because now he's becoming someone who actually runs the country. And he can't be amorphous anymore. And it can't just be about sunshine and rainbows and lollipops. It has to be about making hard decisions. And hard decisions disappoint people. And much as Obama had a sort of crash when he had to transition to someone who's actually wrestling with the grubby business of politics, that's what Trudeau's going to have to do now. And it's going to be very interesting to watch someone who built his political appeal on relentless optimism and dynamism and giving people a sense of hope after many years of Harper becoming increasingly negative political presence in Canada. How is he going to then transition to the actual hard, difficult, and often unattractive business of politics? This is, at once, it's the greatest moment for Trudeau, but he's about to embark on this, what is, for all politicians of his type, an existential challenge. And although I have spent a little bit of time with him, I have no idea how he's going to fail or succeed in that task.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's always really great to talk to you, and I learned so much, and hopefully the viewers do too. And it's great to catch up with you.
I'm just happy when anyone is interested in Canada.
I'm always interested in Canada, and
I know you are. You even visited.
Yeah, I did. We hung out in Toronto, and I hope I'll get a chance to do that again. Although I have no immediate plans to. Brooklyn is keeping me very busy. But anyway, I am very excited to see what's next for Canada. So thank you, John.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
Take care.